I've been driving over the road for 6 long years. When you spend that much time pulling 40,000 pounds of freight through the dead of night, you learn to live with a very specific kind of silence. It isn't just the absence of sound, it's a heavy, crushing weight that fills the cab of your truck. You get used to the hypnotic, rhythmic hum of the asphalt beneath your tires. You get used to staring into the endless, unchanging stretch of black highway. But there is one specific stretch of road that every single long-haul trucker dreads after midnight. Interstate 80, cutting straight through the western edge of Nebraska. It is a completely flat, barren wasteland. For nearly 80 miles, there is absolutely nothing. No gas stations, no rest stops, and absolutely zero cellular service. If your rig breaks down out there, you are entirely on your own in the dark. It was a bitter Thursday night in late October. The clock on my dashboard had just clicked over to 2:14 a.m. Outside, a brutal autumn thunderstorm was tearing through the plains. The rain was slamming against my windshield in deafening, violent sheets. It sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the glass. My heavy wipers were fighting a losing battle, slapping back and forth on their highest setting. The bright, high beams of my Peterbilt cut through the downpour, but they only illuminated gray walls of water and the faded white lines on the slick asphalt. I was hauling a tightly sealed dry van filled with expensive consumer electronics. The weight of the load made the truck feel sluggish on the wet, pooling highway. My eyes were growing heavy, burning from hours of staring into the pitch black. To keep myself from nodding off, I reached over and switched on my CB radio. Usually, even in the middle of nowhere, you can catch something. The distant, static-filled chatter of other drivers swapping weather warnings or telling jokes, but tonight the speaker emitted nothing but a dead, low hiss. It was a hollow, empty, white noise that somehow made the cab feel even lonelier. I reached out my hand to adjust the squelch dial, trying to clean up the signal. That was when the static abruptly broke. It didn't break for a voice. It was a rhythmic, mechanical clicking sound. 3 sharp, distinct clicks. A long, agonizing pause, then 3 more clicks. It sounded exactly like someone tapping a long fingernail directly against a microphone. I picked up my heavy plastic handset and keyed the mic. "Any drivers eastbound on 80? Check channel 19, I said into the dark. The tapping stopped instantly. The silence that followed through the radio speaker was heavy and suffocating. I waited for 5 seconds, listening to the crackle of the storm outside. Then a voice finally came through. It didn't sound like any trucker I had ever heard. It was incredibly clear, completely free of the usual background fuzz or radio static. It sounded like a young woman, but her tone was entirely flat, robotic, and completely devoid of human emotion. She didn't ask for help, and she didn't state her location. She just whispered a single, long sequence of numbers. Geographical coordinates. I frowned, letting go of the mic button and staring out into the pouring rain. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a local prankster playing with a powerful base station, or maybe some weird signal bleed from a government channel. I reached over and switched the CB radio off entirely, cutting the power. The cab returned to the familiar drone of my massive diesel engine and the heavy splashing of water inside my wheel wells, but the unease had already taken root in my stomach. Exactly 2 minutes later, a sharp, piercing electronic beep shattered the quiet of the cab. It was a sound my truck had never made before. I glanced down, and my heart skipped a beat. My dashboard digital display, the small LCD screen between my speedometer and tachometer, glitched out. The fuel gauge, oil temperature readouts, and odometer completely vanished. In their place, a line of text began to rapidly code itself across the screen. Bright green characters blinking against the dark background. It was the exact same sequence of numbers the flat voice on the radio had just spoken. My stomach dropped into a cold pit. I tapped the glass screen hard with my knuckle, hoping it was just a strange electrical short, but the display remained completely frozen, glaring back at me. My truck was still running perfectly, pulling strong at 65 miles per hour. But the internal electronics were clearly being hijacked by something. I looked up at my rearview mirror to check the sides of my trailer. The highway behind me was a wall of pure blackness. No trailing headlights, no signs of life, just empty road. Suddenly, without warning, my high beams flickered twice and died. Total, absolute darkness swallowed the world. Panicking, I slammed my hand onto the dashboard light switch, cycling it back and forth. Desperately. Nothing happened. The dashboard lights were dead. The headlights were dead. Everything was gone. I was barreling down an invisible highway at high speed, completely blind in a 40-ton semi-truck. Adrenaline surged through my veins like ice water. I forced myself not to slam on the brakes completely, knowing the massive weight of the trailer would jackknife on the slick, wet pavement and flip the rig. Instead, I began to pump the brakes firmly, trying to bleed off speed in the blind dark. The truck slowed down, whining loudly as it dropped to 30 miles per hour. Just as I felt the tires begin to grip the shoulder, the headlights slammed back on with blinding intensity. Right in the center of my lane, less than 50 feet ahead, stood a tall figure. It was a man wearing a bright yellow, high-visibility rain slicker. He was standing perfectly still in the middle of the torrential downpour, staring directly into my oncoming chrome grille. He wasn't moving a muscle, completely indifferent to the massive truck rushing toward him. I slammed both hands onto the steering wheel and ripped it violently to the left. At the exact same time, my left foot mashed the air horn valve, sending a deafening roar into the night. The tires screamed against the wet asphalt as the heavy truck swerved into the passing lane. Behind me, the massive trailer swung violently, the rear tires slipping onto the muddy median shoulder. I fought the wheel, counter-steering with everything I had, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Somehow, I managed to stabilize the massive rig and bring it back into a straight line. I immediately checked my driver's side mirror, fully expecting to see the man rolling on the pavement or running out of the way. But the road behind me was completely empty. The white line stretched back into the storm, entirely vacant. There was no one there. I pulled over onto the shoulder, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Before I could even reach for the air brake yellow knob to park the truck, the CB radio on my dashboard clicked itself back on. The power light glowed a sinister red, even though the physical dial was turned to the off position. The speaker burst to life with a loud pop of static, and that same flat, emotionless voice filled the tight space of the cab once again. "You missed the turn," she whispered, her voice sounding closer to the microphone than before. "We are waiting for you at the old scale house." My hands were shaking so violently I could barely keep my fingers wrapped around the steering wheel. The sweat on my palms felt cold against the worn plastic. The next exit was less than 5 miles down the road, according to my mental map of the route. It was an old, state-run way station that had been completely abandoned since the early 90s. The green digits on my dashboard display were still frozen, glaring at me in the dark. The coordinates stared back at me like a countdown timer waiting to expire. I kept my speed dangerously low, barely touching 40 miles per hour as I crawled through the storm. The rain felt even heavier now, slamming against the aluminum roof of the cab with an aggressive, deafening roar. Up ahead, a faint, sickly amber glow began to cut through the thick wall of falling water. It was the entrance ramp to the derelict scale house. The large overhead digital signs that usually read "open" or "closed" were completely dark and rusted out. But as my truck drew closer, I saw a familiar shape standing directly beneath the single flickering exit light. It was the high-visibility yellow rain slicker, the exact same man from the middle of the highway. He was standing perfectly straight, his face completely hidden beneath the deep shadow of his hood. Slowly, deliberately, he raised a single arm and pointed his index finger toward the auxiliary scale lane. My foot instinctively moved toward the accelerator pedal. Every survival instinct in my body was screaming at me to blow right past him and stay on the main interstate. But the moment I tried to press down on the gas, my engine began to violently sputter and cough. The RPM gauge dropped sharply, the needle bouncing erratically near zero as the truck lost power fast. The engine was dying on its own, choking out, effectively forcing my 40-ton rig off the main highway and onto the exit ramp. I rolled onto the cracked, uneven concrete of the old way station lot. My headlights flickered rhythmically, casting long, dancing shadows over the crumbling brick facade of the abandoned building. There were no other trucks parked in the lot. There were no state troopers, no lights in the windows, and no signs of human life. It was just a derelict, forgotten property overgrown with thick weeds pushing through the cracked pavement. I rolled the truck to a complete stop, positioning the tires right on top of the old, rusted metal scale plates. The moment the brakes locked, the engine cut out entirely, plunging the cab into total silence. The sudden lack of engine noise inside the small space was absolutely deafening. The high beams stayed stuck on, pointing like two massive searchlights directly into the thick black woods at the edge of the property. I sat there frozen in the driver's seat, listening to the metallic ticking of the rapidly cooling engine. Then a heavy metallic clunk echoed from somewhere underneath the back of the truck. It was a deep, resonant sound that vibrated straight through the floorboards and into my boots. It felt exactly like someone had stepped heavily onto the trailer hitch or the rear bumper. The entire 60-foot rig rocked slightly on its suspension, tilting just a fraction of an inch to the left. I reached out and adjusted the power mirror switch on the door panel, trying to get a better angle. The glass hummed as it tilted downward, covered in streaks of wind-blown rain. The heavy downpour made it incredibly difficult to see clearly, but my heart stopped when I focused on the rear doors. The heavy steel padlock I always placed on the trailer latch was completely gone. The thick steel locking rod was swinging loosely in the wind, clanging rhythmically against the aluminum skin of the trailer. Someone, or something, had cleanly cut the security seal while I was driving. Before I could even process how that was possible, a soft, dry scratching sound started directly on the roof of my sleeper berth, right above my head. It sounded like long, coarse fingernails dragging slowly across the fiberglass shell of the cab. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It moved slowly from the front windshield toward the back wall of the sleeping compartment. I reached down with a trembling hand and pulled my heavy, solid metal maglite flashlight from the side pocket of the door. My breath was coming in short, rapid gasps, instantly fogging up the cold glass of the side windows. The temperature inside the cab was plummeting fast, dropping so low I could see the white mist of my own breath. I grabbed my smartphone from the center console to call for help, but the screen remained totally black. The glass backing of the phone felt burning hot to the touch, completely dead and fried from the inside. The scratching on the roof suddenly stopped, leaving only the sound of the rain. Then came three incredibly loud, heavy thuds directly against the back wall of the cab. The metal wall shook right behind the thin mattress of my bunk. A low whisper broke through the darkness, but it didn't come from the CB radio speaker this time. It was emitting from the small, dusty mesh speaker grill of the sleeper berth's old intercom system, a system that wasn't even wired to a power source. "The weight is wrong," the flat, emotionless voice murmured right into the back of my neck. "You're carrying too much freight." I spun around violently in my seat, shining the bright beam of my flashlight into the pitch-black opening of the back bunk. The thick, heavy privacy curtain was pulled completely shut, blocking my view of the mattress. The dark fabric was entirely still, hanging like a shroud in the beam of my light. I held my breath, listening intently over the pounding of my own racing pulse. Slowly, the heavy velvet curtain began to move. Something on the other side was pushing its way forward, pressing against the heavy fabric from the inside of my dark bunk. The heavy velvet fabric of the curtain stretched tighter and tighter toward me. It formed the unmistakable, sharp silhouette of a hand pressing against the cloth from the inside. But it wasn't a normal hand. The fingers were impossibly long, thin and skeletal, ending in sharp, jagged points. I stood up from the driver's seat, my knees buckling from pure terror as my boots caught on the floor mat. I raised the heavy metal maglite flashlight, gripping it like a club with both hands. The beam of light trembled violently, dancing across the center of the shifting curtain. "Get out of my truck," I choked out, my voice cracking under the suffocating weight of the air. The hand behind the curtain froze for a second, then slowly retracted back into the darkness of the bunk. The sleeper berth fell into total, absolute stillness once again. For 5 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart against my ribs. Then, without warning, the interior dome lights of the cab snapped on with blinding, harsh intensity. At the exact same instant, the heavy power locks on both doors clicked down loudly, locking me inside the metal cage. The digital dashboard display flared to life, flashing bright, chaotic red lines of unreadable code across the glass. The flat, robotic voice didn't whisper this time. It erupted from every single speaker in the truck at once, distortion tearing through the audio. "Open the rear case." I didn't think. I threw myself at the driver's side door handle, pulling it violently with all my strength, but the electronic lock refused to budge. I spun around, raised the heavy butt of the metal flashlight, and smashed it repeatedly into the side window glass. The glass shattered into 1,000 spiderweb cracks with a deafening crack, but the safety tent held the fragments together. Behind me, the sleeper curtain tore open with a violent rip. I refused to look back, knowing that whatever was climbing out of that bunk would end me if I hesitated for a single second. I threw my entire body weight against the cracked, compromised window glass, bursting through the frame and tumbling out into the freezing rain. My body hit the wet concrete of the scale house lot hard, scraping my hands and face raw on the rough asphalt. The icy downpour hit my skin, shocking my system and forcing adrenaline to flood my veins. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the sharp pain in my shoulder, and sprinted toward the front of the truck. My only thought was to reach the main highway and wave down a passing motorist or a state trooper. But as I rounded the front chrome bumper of the Peterbilt, I stopped dead in my tracks, my boots sliding in the mud. The high beams of the truck were still shining brightly, cutting two massive white tunnels into the dense woods at the edge of the property. Standing perfectly aligned in the bright white light were dozens of them. Dozens of tall figures, all wearing identical yellow, high-visibility rain slickers, standing shoulder to shoulder among the trees. They were all staring directly at my truck, completely motionless despite the wind and rain tearing through the branches. But they had no faces. Where their eyes, noses, and mouths should have been, there was nothing but smooth, pale, reflective skin. Suddenly, a massive, heavy metallic groan echoed from the back of my rig, drawing my attention away from the trees. The heavy steel doors of my cargo trailer were being slowly pushed open from the inside, the metal hinges screeching in the night. I turned around slowly, completely paralyzed by a primordial fear that rooted my feet to the concrete. The inside of the cargo trailer was a cavern of pitch blackness, but something large was shifting within the broken electronics crates. A figure stepped out of the darkness of the trailer, dropping lightly onto the wet asphalt right into the light of the facility. It was wearing a matching leather trucker jacket, dark jeans, and heavy work boots. It had my exact height, my exact posture, and my exact build. As the entity walked closer into the light, it slowly turned its head toward me, allowing the flickering amber light to hit its features. It was my own face staring back at me, except its eyes were completely hollow, pitch-black voids, and a wide, unnatural grin split its jawline far wider than humanly possible. The duplicate of me raised its arm, pulled my actual set of keys from its pocket, and clicked the key fob button. The massive diesel engine of my Peterbilt roared to life with a deafening, thunderous rumble that shook the ground. The duplicate climbed effortlessly into the high driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and engaged the gears. The heavy air brakes hissed loudly, releasing the locking mechanism on the wheels. The massive semi-truck began to roll forward, accelerating off the rusted scale plates and heading back toward the entrance ramp of Interstate 80. I stood there entirely alone in the pouring rain, watching my own taillights fade away into the darkness of the highway. Behind me, the dozens of yellow-coated figures in the woods slowly turned their faceless heads away from the empty road and focused their attention entirely on me.